with the question and so forth. So I'm Jack Barlow. I'm a professor of politics here at Juniata College in Pennsylvania, apparently not that far away. And I will have my fellow judges introduce themselves, and then you guys can do the introduction. So Dr. Stewart.
Yeah, my name is Joe Stewart. I teach in the political science department at Clemson University in South Carolina. I used to get to Western Maryland periodically when I lived over in West Virginia and get over to Garrett County in that area. So I've been a little way into Western Maryland. Great to see you. Congratulations on your work.
I'm Tim Moore from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I see we have a little federalism going there with the flags, the national and state. So thank you.
Very good. Okay, and would you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
My name is Lena Elmohandis. I am a senior from Boonsboro High School, and I intend to study at a four-year university next year to major in biology and creative writing.
My name is Abby Fazenbaker, and I'm a junior at Boonsboro High School. And after high school, I plan to attend Palm Beach Atlantic University to further my lacrosse career, and don't know what I'm planning to major in yet.
I'm Andrew Simonson. I'm a junior at Boonsboro High School, and I plan to attend our four-year university to study computer science. And this is our, with us today is our teacher, Ms. Vasic.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Representing the union.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lena, I will just mention that Juniata College has an excellent biology department, and we also have a creative writing program, so.
I might just have to go.
Yeah, okay.
Don't suck up to him.
And Abby, don't worry about not having chosen a major. The average student goes through 5 majors these days. So
that's right.
Whatever you choose first, you'll change your mind.
Yeah, do what you like.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question for today, I think it's no surprise to you, is question 1. So I will read it and we will get started. The states sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention to join with other states, quote, in devising and discussing all such alterations and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. To what extent, if any, did the delegates follow their instructions? What experiences of state governments under the new constitutions after independence might have influenced the creation of the Constitution? And do the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court function as a continuing constitutional convention? Why or why not? And you may begin.
The delegates did not explicitly follow their instructions to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, they considered all provisions which were necessary to form a federal government that would stand the test of time, which ultimately resulted in the creation of an entirely new document.
After the Annapolis Convention of September 1786, the delegates agreed it was necessary to extend the revision of the federal system to all of its defects and called for appointed commissioners to meet in Philadelphia. The publicly accepted instructions for the delegates were purely to revise the articles as published by most states.
To this straightforward degree, the answer is no. The delegates did not follow the instruction to revise the articles. Instead, they framed a stronger national government, which would be the utmost moment to the peace and the liberty of the states, as said by Hamilton in Federalist 9.
Madison writes in Federalist 40 that the convention was authorized to propose this mixed constitution, and that if necessary provisions in prior institutions did not coincide, the means should be sacrificed to the end rather than the end to the means. In other words, any and all new provisions required to create an enduring government should be added, regardless of whether they concurred with the articles.
The delegates may not have purely revised the articles, but they fulfilled all other stated and implied instructions. Madison adds in Federalist 40 that the principles of the Constitution are only an expansion of the principles in the articles. By his account, the delegates followed all instructions thoroughly and entirely.
Based on varying factors such as location and constituency, every state had different ideas about what they preferred for a constitution.
Pennsylvania's first constitution is considered to be the most radical of the period. John Adams described it to be so democratical that it must produce confusion and every evil work.
At the other extreme, South Carolina was much stricter, requiring candidates to be white men who owned enough property. They believed that only those who were financially independent had the self-control and responsibility to make reasonable judgments pertaining to public matters.
The National Constitution finds a fair middle ground between these two policies in running for office. though age is only a factor that remains from both ideals largely unchanged today.
In Massachusetts, the voters rejected the proposed constitution in 1778 and instead held a special convention in 1780 for elected representatives, which served as the inspiration for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The required 2/3 of voters approved the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. This was the first time voters ratified a state constitution.
The Articles of Confederation loosely follow New Hampshire's first constitution, which provides no office for governor or an amendment process. The Articles enter the states into a firm league of friendship with minimal powers delegated to any central government and a vague amendment process listed in Article 13.
The National Constitution, introduced in 1787, is far more Republican in terms of the federal structure between levels of government, similar to Massachusetts.
The Supreme Court has certainly made decisions that have changed the direction of society or the common interpretation of the Constitution, such as in Terry v. Ohio, U.S. v. Nixon, and Abrams v. U.S. However, these decisions do not alter the literal text of the Constitution.
The Supreme Court's interpretations are bound by the text of the Constitution and amendments. Their decisions are not permanent, though they often follow precedent.
The Supreme Court may change a previous decision, such as in Brown v. Board, which overturned a separate but equal doctrine held in Plessy v. Ferguson. Additionally, courts rely on executive enforcement force decisions, unlike the legislative body, whose decisions are inherently enforceable.
A more accurate comparison to a constitutional convention would be the amendment process. Unlike a Supreme Court decision, an amendment cannot be overturned. It must be repealed by a new amendment.
Amendments directly add to or change the Constitution. They are a creation of law like the writing of the Constitution in Philadelphia.
State legislatures also may assemble a constitutional convention for the purpose of proposing amendments, and 3/4 of states must approve each amendment to be passed. This is nearly identical to the Convention of 1787.
Finally, it is not the intention of the judicial branch to serve as a continuing constitutional convention. The Supreme Court will consider a case only if it poses a legitimate question to the interpretation of the constitutional text, and despite their effect, their decision will not alter the governing text itself.
The concept of separation of powers would be disrupted if the Supreme Court, the only unelected branch of government, had the ability to alter the supreme law of the land.
Thank you for listening to our testimony. We are now ready for your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to go with something that you said in your statement. You said, well, they didn't. You said they didn't explicitly follow their instructions. But couldn't you argue that in a in a popular government, that it's really important to have a government that explicitly follows instructions, that otherwise government is out of the control, out of the hands of the people who gave it its power?
There's certainly that argument could be made, and that argument was made. When you look at examples like Luther Martin and John Francis Mercer, they thought the same thing. They thought the secrecy rule and the entire idea of getting rid of the articles and establishing a stronger central government would be disrupting the ideals of the new nation. So they left. They didn't like this change. But when looking back in hindsight, of course, we're biased with our viewpoint, knowing that without this change, the United States was unlikely to survive on the world stage. We were too loosely bound.
Additionally, at the time, the majority of the colonies did not have a favorable opinion of expanding the national government, since the state governments had been pretty much the main government of the people of each state at the time. However, since Madison and Hamilton had designed the Constitutional Convention to revise the article, not just revise the articles, but to replace it entirely, they fulfilled their instructions. However, they did not necessarily tell the public what their actual instructions were. Otherwise, the Constitutional Convention would never have gotten off the ground, since the states would have shut it down before it began.
Thanks. Tim?
Go ahead, Tim.
Let me just ask a hypothetical. Would you have found it easy or difficult to criticize this convention, given who's there at the convention?
There were many important anti-federalists that were absent from the Constitutional Convention, notably Thomas Jefferson, who was away in France on a diplomatic mission, who would have definitely been against the stronger national government proposed at the Constitutional Convention. So this lack of a lot of the strong anti-federalists would have been a major problem at the time, considering how like since those big voices of a specific side were missing from the discussion.
An alternative perspective could be the fact that the people that were there, though, are the writers of the state constitutions that have primarily already been written all around the states. These large voices, even the anti-federalists that were there, took part in the creation of their own governments in the states, so they knew what it was that their state was looking for. Additionally, a lot of these delegates came straight from the Annapolis Convention, of where the idea for the Constitutional Convention originated.
I think I understood, well, you said that legislative decisions are inherently enforceable. What makes legislative decisions more enforceable than judicial decisions?
So a legislative decision is ultimately the creation of policy, and policy is law. And in order to be a citizen with following your civic duty, you must obey the law. While a court decision, it sets a precedent based on law that already exists. So when we look at things like Brown v. Board of Ed, they made a decision, but this decision was not necessarily followed. So they had to make a follow-up decision in Brown v. Board of Ed 2 in order to further enforce the decision that was made in the first case.
Other follow-ups on that? Okay. So I want to know, you said something in the opening statement that the Constitution stood the test of time. And I'm wondering if we could express that as a qualification for how the delegates to the convention would exercise their power, right? You need to write something that's going to stand the test of time. How would we measure that?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase your question?
I don't know if I can, but I'll try. How do you make sure, how do you know that what you're doing is going to stand the test of time?
So
Well, this was a very bold decision on behalf of the delegates, as especially like in Europe, like a lot of the governments, like foreign governments, were monarchies at the time. Such a republic had not been tried, such as the Constitution. So while there is real no way to know for sure whether or not the Constitution would stand the test of time, but one of the big things that one of the big benefits of federalism is that some of the powers were were adjusted like between the state and the federal government to like whether or not like if there was an issue with the current government that was in place, then the national or state government could essentially take their powers back, such as during the Great Depression, where the national government took up much of the state responsibility economically to try to stabilize the economy.
ultimately, the Constitution created a government that was flexible. Power could be shifted between the national states and local governments with federalism, and the Constitution was written in a way that it was expressively vague.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job. Okay, take a deep breath.